So Charles Brush built a giant windmill for the day. It was still a giant windmill in the early 1980s. In the 1980s, we were installing wind turbines 17 meters in diameter. It's almost 100 years after Charles Brush tried the same thing. It was a wind turbine far bigger than any of the windmills that were being produced in the United States at the same time.
Hi, I'm Henry Sanderson, and welcome to the first episode of the Electric Revolution podcast. This podcast will start with the true history of clean energy and eventually move to the present day. This episode is about Charles Brush, one of the first people to build a wind turbine to generate electricity. My guest today is Paul Gipe. He has been a wind power advocate for over 4 decades. He's the author of numerous books on the wind industry, including Wind Energy for the Rest of Us and Wind Energy Comes of Age. Well, Paul, thanks so much for joining me. I wonder if you could just introduce yourself to begin with.
Yeah, I'm Paul Gipe. I'm a self-styled expert in wind energy. I've worked in renewable energy for over 40 years. I live in California, and I came to live in California because there were lots of wind turbines going to be installed here. But I was working in wind energy before they started installing wind turbines in California.
Wow, so that goes back a long way. Well, today we're going to go back even further to the very origins of wind turbines and using wind to generate electricity. So today we want to talk about Charles Brush. He's one of the pioneers of wind turbines. I wonder if you could tell me a bit about what you know about him and his first turbine that he built in 1887, 1888.
Well, Charles Brush was a famous American inventor, not as well known as Thomas Edison, who was a competitor of his. Brush made his fame in electric arc lighting in the Cleveland area. He built an industry for producing electric arc lighting. So this is before Edison's incandescent bulb, or if the British, whoever invented the incandescent bulb. But anyway, for Americans, it's Thomas Edison. And he was an inventor, but he was not a scientist. He didn't publish a lot because country's very competitive, and being an inventor at the late 19th century was quite competitive. As I said, he was a competitor of Thomas Edison, and Edison was a ruthless entrepreneur. So Charles Brush built a giant windmill for the day. It was still a giant windmill in the early 1980s. In the 1980s, we were installing wind turbines 17 meters in diameter. It's almost 100 years after Charles Brush tried the same thing. It was a wind turbine far bigger than any of the windmills that were being produced in the United States at the same time. He patterned his windmill or wind turbine, because it was used to produce electricity, after the American water pumping windmills that were extensively used across the great breadth of the United States and also in continental Europe and in the UK. So it had multiple blades, literally hundreds of wooden slats for blades. It was upwind of the tower. It had a monstrous tail vane that would point it into the wind. And the way it controlled the operation of the turbine to protect itself in high winds so it wouldn't destroy itself, they used what we call a pilot vane. That was a common technique at the time. And that would turn the wind turbine out of the wind during high winds. So that's the essence of what he did. He did that in 1888. Of course, there were other people who built wind turbines or windmills producing electricity before Brush, but he was, and there could have been other Americans who had done it at the time, but Brush is most well known because there was a feature in Scientific American that looked at his wind turbine and had illustrations of his batteries. And of course, he was famous at the time, a very wealthy man. And he could afford this. He could afford building this thing, and he could afford maintaining it. It wasn't just a hobby horse at the time. He used it to power the lighting in his home, mostly arc lights, before they got the Edison incandescent bulbs. Later, he converted all his arc lights to incandescent lamps.
I think what's so fascinating, as you say, is he powered his home, and he also stored the electricity in 12 batteries in his basement. So he was able to generate a constant source of electricity, right, from the variable nature of the wind.
Well, I would like to say we never will know. That was the intent, of course, and maybe early on in his experiments with the windmill, it provided reliable service to his batteries. But as someone who's worked in wind energy all his professional life, I really find it hard to believe some of his claims at the time about how well this wind turbine worked, how long it worked. I just think that he had a common American trait of rather overstating his accomplishments. And it could be that the wind turbine didn't perform as well as it's been written up in Scientific American and other sources. The best history that I've seen on Charles Brush was done by Robert Ryder. He's a professional historian, and he wrote a book, Wind Energy in America, History. And he has the most extensive discussion of Charles Brush's wind turbine. But yeah, the intent was, because there was not central station power, there was not electricity from the city of Cleveland to his home. So if he wanted electricity, and if apparently he wanted to experiment with electricity, he used the wind turbine to make electricity and store it in the batteries in his basement. And after he stopped using the wind turbine, because the city of Cleveland eventually brought electricity to his house, he continued to use the batteries in the basement for his experiments. Now, a question arises, okay, that sounds fine, but maybe the batteries were just too big to get out of the basement. And that's a question, too. I mean, did he build a house around the batteries, or did he put the batteries in the house? That's a question that other historians are going to have to answer.
So you're skeptical of his claim that he told a journalist it operated for 20 years without any problems, right?
Oh, absolutely. I would challenge that claim. I have no historical documentation to show that he didn't do it, but I find it really hard to believe after working in this industry for so long. We still have trouble keeping our wind turbines running. So I can't imagine that a machine of that kind would be easy to maintain, and he could afford to maintain it because he was wealthy. And I'm sure he had, the pictures that we all show of this wind turbine, it shows somebody mowing the grass nearby for scale. I mean, it's a posed photograph, of course. And that shows that he has caretakers and people around doing the work for him while he experimented in the basement with his batteries. But, he took the rotor off the turbine. At one point, after he got electricity from the city of Cleveland, he no longer needed the windmill to produce electricity for the lighting because he had that in the house. And he took the rotor off, but it left the tower standing. And of course, that's another weakness of many Americans. As we leave our trash on the landscape, we don't clean it up when we're done with it. And he was guilty of that. He left that tower standing. It was a quite attractive tower for us this day and age. We look at it as, late 19th century, almost Victorian, but it was non-functional on the landscape. It was only after he died was it removed. So, yeah, I'm a bit skeptical about his accomplishments.
But going back to the origin of the wind turbine, why do you think he did it? Was it that he was reading, as you say, in Scientific American, there was lots of talk and debate about using the wind for electricity. There were other people that came before him, James Blythe in Scotland, others in Europe. Do you think he knew about these other experiments and was influenced? Why did he do it, do you think?
First of all, he didn't have electricity at his home. So he needed a source of electricity, and he could probably build some kind of power plant, maybe a gasoline engine. They weren't really prevalent at the time. I mean, they existed, but they weren't prevalent. And it could be that he was familiar with the intellectual current of the day by following Scientific American and talking with his colleagues around the world, well, between the United States and Europe primarily. But also there's, of course, just a human desire. The wind is free and it's there, and why don't we use it? I think that would probably be part of it as well. Cleveland is on Lake Erie. So for places like the state of Ohio, that's one of the windiest areas of the state. But, he wasn't on the shore of the lake. He was a little ways removed from the lake. And so, maybe he, spent his summers at the beach and said, it's windy here, let's use it. I don't know. We wait for another historian to dive into Charles Brush's history, and we'd like them to focus on the history of why he developed this wind turbine and what was the real success of it, if it was successful. I mean, he used it. That's a success in itself. I mean, he built it. That was a success. He used it. That was a success. Got a lot of press for it. That was a success. But he never tried to market it. It was just solely for his own use. And that's a distinction I'd like to make with the other inventors of the period. With James Blythe, for example, he was a scientist. He published he made observations, and he published his observations. He shared them with other people, including the most fundamental observation of what it takes to have a windmill. And I'll just read it because it's the essence of wind energy. Any fool can make a wind turbine go round to generate electricity, but the challenge is to make one that can be left unattended without overspeeding to destruction. That's the story of wind energy. Yeah, we still struggle with that.
Fascinating. And so in terms of why his wind turbine didn't take on, was it the coming of the central electricity grid? I mean, you mentioned he eventually hooked up to the grid himself, I think in 1906. Was that, why didn't wind turbines take on elsewhere?
Well, according to Robert Ryder, we don't know if he anticipated this was going to be an invention that he would market. He built it for his purpose at his estate, and he used it for that purpose. There's no evidence that he considered manufacturing this wind turbine for use at other wealthy estates across the United States. I mean, this was the era of the robber barons, so there were a lot of wealthy Americans who could afford something like this. And in fact, that's the way many of the early windmills, particularly the big ones, were used at wealthy estates to provide water for flushable toilets. That was a major technological innovation. Eventually, then, it kind of drifted down to the plebeians, the proletariat, to use windmills to pump water as well. Well, I don't think there's any evidence that he planned to market it. It served his purpose there. For us today, the tower is very ornate. It was quite attractive. The tower, from our perspective, like I said, it's almost Victorian. And it was well conceived. It was a post mill. So like many European windmills or windmills in central England, they stood on a post and the turbine rotated to face the wind on the post. And so this was not a post, it was a massive hunk of steel that was embedded in concrete in the ground. But because the force of the wind on such a huge rotor, 17 meters in diameter, it's really big for us as humans. It's considered small now by modern wind turbine standards, but for us as humans, it's huge. The force of the wind on the tower would tend to bend this thing, and the steel, of course, has certain strengths. And one of the strengths that you want to keep it within is the elastic strength, so that it can bend, but it doesn't deform. And so to avoid that, this was very clever of him. He put outriggers, and the outriggers were on casters or rollers, and there was a circular track. So when the wind forced the tower to bend backwards, the casters would support the tower, so it never exceeded the elastic strength of the steel in the post. I thought that was pretty clever.
That's fascinating. So he's actually quite advanced technically for his time.
Yeah, I don't think we saw a tracked wind turbine. So a wind turbine that would face the wind and it would be on a metal track. Now, there are Dutch windmills and probably English windmills that do that. But a wind turbine generate electricity, I don't think we saw that until the 1930s with the Soviet Union. Got to be careful these days, not say Russian or Ukrainian. It's the Soviet Union wind turbine at Balaclava, which used a circular track.
And even though he didn't patent it and he didn't market it, it must have influenced visitors, must have influenced some people, right? It did get written up in the press, as you said. So what is its legacy in terms of promoting wind energy?
Well, we Americans are proud of that he accomplished this. And of course, for many Americans, he built the first electricity generating windmill, which is not true. But for many years, we could make that claim until someone in Scotland said, no, wait a minute. James Blythe was doing this too before Charles Brush. And then the French, of course, saying, well, wait a minute, there's the Duc de Feltre, he was in the harbor at Le Havre, and he built a wind turbine too. And now the Austrians are involved saying, oh, no, we beat you all. We had a wind turbine, 4 years before Blythe and Brush and all those people. So, yeah, I don't know what his legacy is. It's a great photograph of his wind turbine. His wind turbine was not a commercial turbine, but it looked like the commercial wind pumps, American water pumping windmill, that was prevalent on the Great Plains in the United States, was being sold in the thousands. And that kind of wind turbine was used extensively in Europe as well. You can still drive down roads in the UK or on the continent, and you'll see an old water pumping windmill. Well, those all came from designs of the United States, and they would either buy the design or they'd copy the design, and they were factories of building this kind of wind turbine. So, for example, Charles de Gouillon, the Duc de Feltre, he adapted U.S. wind engine and pump companies' power mill. So this is a wind turbine that would be designed not to pump water, but to transmit power to the ground, and you could use it to saw timber and do everything that you need power. You could use it to drive a generator, and that's what he did. So he adapted a power windmill for his application there on the coast of France. And it's the same with Joseph Friedlander in Austria. He adapted a U.S. wind engine and pump company power mill to provide mechanical power at ground level to turn a generator. And that's what he did at the Viennese International Electrical Exposition. So there's a ferment in both the United States and Europe to use these existing windmills, water pumping windmills, to produce electricity. Unfortunately, it was a dead end. And that's not how we have modern wind turbines. So in that sense, he proved you could build a big windmill if you were a wealthy man. They were all men.
Yeah.
But from my perspective of the history of wind energy, that's it.
But there's an interesting bit in the book that you brought up earlier, that perhaps someone, Oliver Fritschel, who later went on to build wind turbines for small farms, actually visited Charles Brush's wind turbine as a young boy with his father. So the influence perhaps was passed on, right?
Right. Yes. In fact, we have a quote from U.S. Wind Engine and Pump Company, their representative, their salesman, their one of their executives, who at a conference said, "Well, yeah, it's worked pretty well," referring to the Brush windmill, and we are continuing to experiment with using our windmills to produce electricity, but the batteries remain far too expensive for widespread use. And so that was in 1891. So they were continuing to think about this as a way to use windmills. And at the period, and Robert Ryder talks about it in his book, and gives examples of the advertisements that you find, and you can still search online. And Internet Archive probably has some pages from some farm journals from the late 19th century. And there's a lot of ads for the water pumping windmill used to produce electricity. Most of those would be the power mills sending the mechanical power to ground level to produce electricity. But some were trying to, adapt particularly after World War I, the Great War, put the generator up on the top. And then we just have the wires come down. There was some of that as well.
So do you think, looking back, that there was a chance for an alternative history where wind-generated electricity would have developed earlier than it did?
No, because, well, I can't imagine it, because I'm immersed in this, and we have been fighting fossil fuels and nuclear power since the revival of wind energy in the 1970s. And so I can't imagine that there would be an alternative future because, as I say, the water pumping windmill adapted to generating electricity was a technological dead end. We really had to wait until Paul Gipe in Denmark began to study how to make a windmill, his ideal windmill, how to make it so it would be more effective, more efficient. And that way you get the windmill is going to be expensive to build, but it might produce more electricity, for example. I mean, these windmills that we're talking about here, they didn't produce a lot of electricity. They're really big, but they don't produce a lot. And to compete with fossil fuels at the time, coal primarily at that time, you needed a windmill that could produce a lot of electricity relative to its cost. And really, we waited. It was necessary for Paul Gipe in Denmark to develop the technology and for the Danes to apply it, because all these other people, they were dabbling. But the Danes took the idea and they created a system for emanating the concept into the countryside. So Paul Gipe wasn't just an inventor. He was also a social activist. And he taught at a school, and he taught students how to make windmills, electricity generating windmills. And those students then went out into the countryside, went out into Denmark to build windmills for communities. And importantly, during a Great War, that was one source of electricity that they had, because they don't have coal. They have very little coal. In Denmark, they hardly have any hydropower because the country is pretty much flat. And so windmills, and of course, they had been using mechanical windmills for centuries, just like you had in the UK. And so they were exposed to the wind. They knew the wind. And when they needed electricity to power factories and some lights, streetlights were very important. The windmill came naturally, and they had a trained cadre, students, technical students. They would call them practical engineers. I think Smedmester, something like that, practical engineers, and they would go out in the community and build windmills. It really required that. What we see with the importance of what Blythe did was he talked about it. He espoused this concept. You got to make the wind turbine so it'll control itself and won't destroy itself, because otherwise it doesn't do anything. It's all pieces. And these others, they were really one off. We did. De Goyen, if you read the history of De Goyen in France, I mean, he's suing the manufacturer, the manufacturer's suing him because he hasn't paid, and it's all a mess. It doesn't go anywhere. And we don't know much more about what Joseph Friedlander did in Austria. We don't know if he sold any of these things. I mean, we'll wait for another historian.
So Brush wasn't a good enough publicist, basically, or good enough for marketing his own invention.
Maybe it wasn't intended to be marketed. I mean, maybe not everything that he did was a product. This, my perspective is it's possible that this machine, this giant machine, was meant just to provide a service to him, to create other products which he could market, other electrical devices, maybe not the windmill. Now, that's my sense of it.
It does seem strange because he was a rich man, right? He lived on Millionaire's Row in this big mansion. So he was obviously good at business, that he didn't sense any sort of business opportunity from what he had made.
According to Robert Ryder and the other sources that I've seen, there's no evidence that he was frustrated in not marketing the wind turbine. I have not seen any evidence of that. But this is a fertile field for historians of technology development, because as we've seen, we keep pushing back the date at which the first wind turbine was used to generate electricity. I published a book in 2016. I said, yep, this is it. This is definitive. Blythe did it in Scotland and everybody else. And then Brush came along. And then a French researcher, of course, poke fun at Americans and Scots, said, oh, no, that was a guy in Austria. He did it first. So, well, okay. We acknowledge he did it first.
Yeah. Well, Paul, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been fascinating to hear your thoughts.